Hello Year 12, this is Mr. Ferreira and I'm going to be talking you through another research method, the research method of observation. Now you've done a bit of research methods with Miss Harries and did experimental methods, and this is seen as a non-experimental method. It's not to say that it's not important to psychologists. We find that we like the flexibility of observation and we have this ability to kind of observe kind of complex interactions, which kind of makes things kind of interesting for us. So an observation is literally kind of saying kind of what we see there, observing something. So in other words, looking and seeing what their behavior is. Now, of course, an experiment kind of deals with cause and effect. So we can use observation in an experiment, certainly in order for us to establish a kind of a DV and kind of observe behavior as variables change. Now, there's a couple of kind of words that we need to be clear on when we talk about observations. So one of them is the word naturalistic. The other one is controlled. Now, this is not any different to experiments. Naturalistic observations happen in the environment which they are in. Okay, and so therefore I could observe children's behavior in a playground, and as long as it's the playground that they normally are playing in, I would call it a naturalistic observation. However, with a naturalistic setting, we do have the problem of controlling extraneous variables, and so therefore I might choose to move my observation from the natural environment into a controlled environment, and therefore it would be called a controlled observation. Now, controlled doesn't have to be horrible or mean or nasty or any of those types of things. It just means that I am trying to control the extraneous variables, A good example of this is a person called Mary Ainsworth, and we'll look at this during the attachment course. She set up a very kind of complete observation called the strange situation, where she took children into a room. The room was lovely, it kind of was carpeted, had a couple of chairs, toys for the child to play with, and she observed them through a two-way mirror. And so therefore, just because it's controlled doesn't mean that it's kind of horrible, but we do kind of risk the chance of the child not particularly acting in the normal way. It actually won't be the child, it'll probably be the mother. The child is kind of oblivious to kind of the surroundings. It's more the mother that might react a little bit different. So they were looking at how the children reacted to their mothers in this controlled environment. So what we can do is we can consider both the positives and negatives of these types of observations. And like we did for any kind of naturalistic study, we do find that it does have external validity, because we are literally looking at everyday life. And so therefore, that is quite a good aspect of a naturalistic explanation. In contrast, it's difficult to control this type of behavior because of the extraneous variables, and so therefore we might find difficulty trying to replicate that type of naturalistic experiment. And we see, like we did for work that was with experiments, kind of what is a positive for one becomes a negative for another, and so forth and so on. So we see here, it says here, in contrast, a controlled observation is easy to replicate. However, it says here, cannot be applied to your real life settings. So this is a positive that we have fewer variables, but of course it's a negative that we can't. So that was your naturalistic versus controlled. The next one is covert versus overt. And I also think, once again, these are not words that you shouldn't know. These are words that you perhaps have heard of before. So covert observation is where it says here, the observation must be public and happening anyway for it to be ethical. Okay, so it says here, if you're recording behavior without first obtaining consent, and the participants are unaware that the focus of the study, we call this covert. So in other words, it's covert if I'm kind of hiding and they don't know that I'm observing them. So that's why we have to deal with ethics when it comes to covert. In contrast, we have overt observations. So this is perhaps if a teacher comes and sits in the room and observes another teacher teaching. It's quite obvious that they're there, they don't hide, so therefore it's important that we have informed consent beforehand. So we see that you can consider observations as being naturalistic versus controlled, overt versus covert. Okay, so not difficult, I would expect. So we do have some positives and negatives that we would probably like to consider. We find that participants are going to potentially behave differently if they know that they're being observed. And so a problem for overt observation is participant reactivity. Okay. So therefore, if I have a covert observation, then it increases the validity because they're going to act in the way that they would normally act. But of course, we have the ethics that we need to consider. Now, of course, we could say then a positive of overt observations is that it is ethically acceptable. However, of course, they know that they're being observed, and so therefore they may act differently. Okay, so I don't think it's meant to be challenging to you, but of course it's just making sure we use the correct terminology. So then we can move on to participant versus non-participant. Okay, so a lot of research now happens where you are participants in your own kind of research. So if I did a study on the school, I'd be a participant, and I can't, deny that I might have some kind of bias and things like that. So we need to consider kind of what is best here. So if you become part of the group, you're the participant observer. I mean, I suppose the classic would be some of those films where we see a police officer becoming a gang member. Okay, becoming part of the gang, you're a participant observer. So we have first-hand experience of what it's like. In contrast, if I am separate from the group, well, I'm a non-participant observer. See, not that difficult. And of course, I'm potentially more objective because I'm separated from the behavior itself. And you could say that I'm impartial, but of course, I might have to do this because it says here that it might be impossible for me to join a particular group. So I can't kind of become part of a 16-year-old kind of female kind of music group, whatever it could be that I'm trying to observe, okay, because I don't have the ability to kind of change kind of who I am. So, of course, like all things, there are positives and negatives behind being participant, non-participant. Of course, the key to participant and kind of why some sociologists actually use participant observation is that they can experience the situation the way that the participants do. So, of course, this gives us insight, okay, and it also increases the validity. And see, the theme of validity is kind of running through this. However, of course, I may end up becoming too involved in the situation. So we say that I identify with the participants, and so therefore I lose objectivity. Okay, and this is definitely the case we see for some police officers when they kind of join particular groups, that they kind of get think about this in terms of social influence, in terms of minority influence. If you become part of the group and start doing the things that they do, you might start to identify with the group and ultimately be converted towards their cause. In contrast, of course, we have non-participant observations. We can be objective, but of course, I'm removed from the behaviour, and so therefore I might not be able to understand or have insight on their behaviour. So that could be seen as a kind of a concern. So I'm hoping that you've seen kind of the different words that we use. We can interchange things, so it can be a non-participant, covert participant, observer, and we can see how we use the different kind of words to describe how I am actually observing the particular people. So the next idea is potentially to look at how do I design my observations. And so for example, one of the easiest ones to do in terms of lack of preparation, difficult to perhaps analyze, is this idea of unstructured observation. So in other words, the observer simply writes down everything they see. Okay, and of course what happens, we have rich detail, and this may well be appropriate if I have a small scale study. In order, I just literally go to the room and observe everything that's happening in that particular room. But of course, the problem with an unstructured, it says here, unstructured observation, is that there might just be too much to record. And so therefore I need to perhaps try and find a way of targeting the behavior that I'm particularly looking at. Okay, so for example, I might look at a targeted behavior of aggression, but we find that I need to perhaps be a little bit more clear on this, because we might need to decide whether we're looking for verbal or physical aggression. And so we see with unstructured that it can suddenly become quite difficult to kind of figure out what exactly is the purpose of the observation. So we might then say, okay, so I can't have an unstructured observation, I need to have a structured observation. And so what I might have to do is have it says here, a predetermined list of behaviors that I will look for. So I might then go back to my example here of, say, verbal aggression, and talk about maybe shouting at somebody, or swearing could be a particular targeted group. And so what I'm ultimately talking about is that whenever we do observations, we need to always have in mind this idea of behavioural categories, that I need to determine particular behaviours that I need to observe. Okay, so for example, the Ainsworth study, she looked at specific behaviours. So she had kind of larger categories like reunion behaviour. So she observed the baby when the mother returned to the room, okay, called reunion. And then she was able to kind of break down the particular behaviour in terms of things like, they are actively seeking comfort, or do they ignore the mother? So we can see how behavioural categories simply help the observer to kind of either have a tally chart where they can tally how many times something happens, okay, but you can't have a tally chart without a category. Okay, so we see that what we need to do is to break the target behaviour into a set of behavioural categories. And it's very similar to operationalising the behaviour that I'm trying to observe. Okay, so of course what I'm trying to do is precisely define my behaviour in order to make my observation measurable. Okay, so you see the example here. It says the target behaviour affection may be broken down into observational categories such as hugging, kissing, smiling, holding hands. Okay, so for example, I might be looking at people's behavior. I mean, this might well actually be an interesting observation at the moment, because we've gone through nearly a year of kind of social distancing and seeing whether people's behavior kind of once social distancing is removed, whether people are kind of as affectionate towards each other in public as they were beforehand. So, of course, this could be obviously very open-ended, but of course, if I start having behavioural categories specifically, I can look at couples, kind of see how many times they kind of maybe touch hands or smile at each other or kind of hug or kiss or things like that. So the difficulty that I have here is, of course, behavioural categories are specific to the study. So you need to look at kind of questions, have past questions, have a look and see, can you think of particular behavioural categories to describe a scenario? So maybe think of observations that you might want to make. Maybe look at your family and see kind of, okay, so if I was, trying to decide whether there's more hostility between your siblings, what type of behavior could I define hostility towards in terms of maybe physical violence, verbal being kind of shouting, screaming, swearing, things like that. So it's always specific to the environment. Okay. Now, of course, the thing that we're looking at says include all of the ways the target behavior may occur. Okay. Now, of course, it could be that this is why we would do something like a pilot study, because maybe there's behavior that we didn't consider and that we will then observe it and then add to it. Okay. So, for example, if I just had a loose category of being loving, then, of course, we could have two observers who observe something and they kind of decide that one behavior is loving and another behavior isn't loving. But if we haven't got behavioral categories, they may not agree. So we do have a goal for every observation that they must be observable, measurable, and self-evident. And behavioral categories are what kind of help define whether the observation has been reliable or not. Now, there's something specific about reliability in observation. It's called inter-observer reliability. We also have inter-rater reliability, which is the key to understanding whether observations have been reliable. Now, what I'm talking about here is that if I'm trying to use observation within a scientific experiment or within a study, I want to make sure that I'm not kind of making mistakes. I'm not kind of creating a situation which other people can't replicate. And so what it does say is that we should always try and at least have two researchers observing the same behavior independently in order to test for reliability. Okay, so how do we test inter-observer reliability? Now, this is quite important. I really like this in exams. Okay, so these are the steps that I would consider for inter-observer reliability. So first of all, we need to have clearly defined and behavioral categories. It's quite good if you familiarize yourself with these particular categories, understand, you could even talk to each other and ask exactly what you mean. Okay, so if I am trying to be reliable, my observers need to understand what the behavioral categories are. Okay, then so let's talk about a scenario. So I'm trying to understand people's behavior in the playground. Okay, so I have a defined area and perhaps I have a set amount of kind of children who are allowed in a particular area and I'm observing their particular behavior. What I then do, this is going to be quite literally, it's going to be covert. So I've got my two observers observing the playground from a one-way mirror, okay? But the key is that they have to observe the same behavior at the same time. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is I'll set a time frame. So think about that correlation diagram I asked you to draw, and I might say, okay, so we're going to split this play time up into segments of 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to have 4 segments, and a time is going to go when a segment is over. Okay, and what we're going to look for is aggressive behavior. Okay, and we define the behavioral categories as to what is aggressive behavior, and they are going to be tallying up the aggressive behavior. Okay, but of course they have to observe the same behavior at the same time, but they've got to be independent. Okay, so in other words, from one-way mirror, one observer observes it, and from standing right next to them, the other observer observes them, but they keep their data to themselves. Okay, once they've done that, they compare the data and see whether they have any differences. Okay, so for example, I observed 15 acts of aggression in the first 15 minutes. Okay, and I've tallied them, and I perhaps can even indicate that there was shouting, there's swearing, there was a kind of punching and things like that. Okay, and of course the other person who's observed at the same time but wasn't observing me, was observing them, has also done something. Maybe they said they had 14. Okay, now of course that's one way which you can make sure that you're reliable, is to have that discussion. But they actually say that the best way to do it is this final step here of correlating the observations. So in other words, if I have a positive correlation of observer A versus observer B, it doesn't have to be a perfect straight line, but as long as it's roughly the same, then I know that the two observers have roughly observed the same thing. Now, going back to Ainsworth, she actually had an inter-rater reliability of nearly kind of 0.95. So of course, in correlation coefficient, 1 is the perfect. Okay, so anything kind of above 0.8 is good. Now, of course, if you can't remember that correlation diagram I asked you to draw in class, where the dots were all over the place, it might actually be difficult for you to kind of understand this. So what we have is a couple of ideas that are specific to the words used: covert, overt, naturalistic, controlled, structured, unstructured. And then we have this idea that we need to check that everything is reliable. Now there's a couple of questions here. What type of observation are the following examples? So observation of differences in behavior of men and women at a pelican crossing. Okay, so it can be naturalistic, because I don't have pelican crossing in my room. Could also be overt or covert, depending on the scenario. Okay. The second one, observation of classroom manners of students in year 7 and 11 by the teachers. Okay, teachers are most likely to be overt. Classroom, naturalistic. Okay, observation and performance in team activities during an interview process. It's usually going to be covert. Okay, or it could be participant as well. Okay, so what I would recommend at this particular stage is that you just simply kind of go through the kind of notes and make sure you understand kind of the different phrases and terminology. That the difficult stuff is this business here about how do we make sure observations are reliable. And that's something which obviously I can talk to you about if you perhaps don't get it. But the key is these particular 4 points. The main two being that they have to observe the same behaviour at the same time, and ultimately we have to correlate their scores with each other. Now, I hope that this video is okay. I hope that we'll be back in school soon and we can talk about kind of what we're going to do after that. Thank you for listening.